The evening felt ordinary until it didn't. I lingered in the foyer, pretending to check my phone while my parents clinked glasses in the lodge, smiling at Hazel as if the house belonged to her. "Nicole, don't worry, you'll get your turn someday," my father said lightly, the words a casual brush-off that burned sharper than any accusation. I forced a smile, nodding, but my hands shook slightly around my glass. The laughter in the room wasn't for me, and every joke that skirted around my absence tightened an invisible cage. I realized how invisible I had become, how their smiles hid judgment, how carefully they'd crafted this hierarchy I was always meant to respect. And yet, in that very room, a single misstep, a door left unlocked, a forgotten code, could shift everything. I stepped back from the foyer and exhaled slowly, pretending the tension didn't exist, though every muscle in me was alert. I'm Nicole, and for years, I let their decisions define my place in this family, quiet, overlooked, dismissed. But tonight, I wasn't just an observer. Watching them celebrate Hazel's elevation, I realized I could see everything they couldn't, the hidden angles, the unlocked doors, the small oversights. And for the first time, I understood that awareness could be a weapon. Life with my family had always been a delicate choreography of silence and observation. I knew my place. Polite, capable, but never enough. Hazel was the golden child, effortlessly favored, her successes amplified while mine were quietly diminished. My parents' idea of love came with invisible strings. I could earn respect only by fitting into their preordained mold, never by challenging it. I managed my career with diligence, handled bills, maintained the home, and watched my own aspirations quietly slip into the background. Even my friends noticed it. How I'd smile at compliments but quickly deflect attention. How I hesitated before asserting myself in a room full of my own family. Every interaction carried a silent expectation. Stay small, stay compliant, stay Nicole. Evenings were the hardest. Dinner conversations revolved around Hazel's latest achievements. My input skimmed over like a ripple on water. Invitations to participate in decisions about the house, finances, or family events were extended only when convenient for them, never because they valued my judgment. My opinions, when offered, were politely acknowledged and then disregarded. It wasn't cruelty. They genuinely thought I needed guidance, that I couldn't handle responsibility. Yet, beneath the calm surface, I kept careful records, notes, and observations. Every bank statement, every transaction, every slight I documented. It wasn't rebellion, it was preparation. I didn't need to act yet. For now, endurance was my armor, patience my shield. And in the quiet, unnoticed spaces of the house, I began to see patterns in their behavior, small openings they left unguarded. One night, as Hazel bragged about a new acquisition in the living room, I noticed a detail that didn't fit. A door ajar, a forgotten camera feed, a crack in their perfect veneer. It started subtly, small comments at family gatherings, seemingly innocent, but each one a thread pulling at my confidence. Hazel would casually mention a property improvement or a financial decision, and my parents would nod approvingly, never looking at me. I tried to interject, offering suggestions or asking questions, but they'd smile politely and move on, as if I hadn't spoken at all. Each dismissal was quiet, almost invisible, yet it carried a weight that settled deep into my chest. I noticed how meetings about investments or renovations were scheduled at times I was busy elsewhere. Emails requesting my input were sent but never truly read. Even when I caught mistakes in calculations or overlooked details, my corrections were acknowledged with a nod and promptly ignored. The message was clear. I existed in their world only on the margins, useful when convenient but never authoritative. One evening, reviewing the home's smart system remotely, I saw something else, a subtle change in access codes, minor shifts in security permissions. On the surface, it seemed trivial, but my instincts told me it was deliberate. Someone was trying to keep me at arm's length, quietly eroding my control without confrontation. That's when I realized patience alone wouldn't be enough. I needed leverage, insight, a way to turn their oversight into opportunity. By the time Hazel laughed about her newest accomplishment in the lounge, I was no longer just observing. I was calculating, noting every small vulnerability, every overlooked protocol, every pattern they assumed I couldn't see. And beneath their careless celebration, I felt the first stirrings of a plan forming, one they would never expect. Even as I quietly observed, the dismissals grew sharper. My suggestions were met with laughter or gentle shakes of the head, as if I were a child testing boundaries. At the weekly family meeting, I recommended reviewing the trust documents before approving a new property purchase. Hazel smirked, and my father waved me off, saying, "Nicole, don't worry your head with adult matters." The words, though calm, carried the full weight of exclusion. I felt a familiar knot in my stomach, but this time I didn't withdraw. I stayed present, nodding politely, taking mental notes of every reaction, every gesture, every word. Their arrogance, their confidence in my supposed incompetence, only sharpened my awareness. I began noticing inconsistencies in their stories about the house, small discrepancies in financial statements, and the way my mother avoided my gaze when topics of inheritance surfaced. It was subtle, but the message was clear. I was expected to remain passive, to accept their control. Even Hazel's compliments were laced with condescension, her smile hiding a smirk of triumph. Each interaction was designed to reinforce their authority and my supposed fragility. Yet, for the first time, I saw a pattern in their behavior, not just random oversight. They underestimated me. Every ignored suggestion, every laugh at my expense, every slight misstatement they made was an opening. I began cataloging their missteps, tracing the cracks in their otherwise flawless facade. By the time dinner ended and they retired to the lodge for their evening celebrations, I had already mapped several vulnerabilities, forgotten passwords, accessible cameras, and doors left unlocked. Their sense of control was a thin veneer, fragile and entirely reversible if one knew where to push. Despite my growing awareness, the isolation was suffocating. At every gathering, I felt the weight of being unseen, a silent observer in my own home. My parents' dismissals weren't dramatic, they were almost invisible, but their effect was cumulative. I began questioning myself. Was I overreacting? Was my sense of injustice simply a result of being too sensitive? Even as I documented every slight, every exclusion, doubt crept in, whispering that perhaps I had misread their intentions. The quiet contempt was exhausting. Hazel's casual dominance, the way my father sought her opinion first, my mother's subtle nods affirming Hazel's every word, all reinforced the narrative that I was secondary, fragile, unworthy. Even friends who visited remarked on the obvious favoritism, but their words only reminded me of how deeply entrenched it was. I was alone in perceiving the underlying truth. Still, I refused to retreat completely. I kept meticulous records of every financial transaction, every alteration in the smart home system, every small inconsistency in their statements. It was a lifeline, a way to anchor myself against the tide of doubt. Each note I took, each anomaly I logged, became a quiet act of rebellion, an assertion of presence in a space where I was otherwise invisible. Late one night, reviewing the smart system feeds, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken, a subtle pattern in their movements, a reliance on technology they believed I didn't understand. It was a risk, but also an opportunity, a vulnerability they had left exposed. For the first time, the doubt that had haunted me was countered by the thrill of potential control, a private knowledge that they would never suspect. The first misstep came disguised as triumph. Hazel celebrated yet another victory, a deal she claimed had been secured without my input. My parents beamed, praising her initiative, and for a moment, it felt as though all my careful observations were meaningless. My suggestions had been ignored, my presence minimized, and the opportunity to assert control seemed to slip further away. I watched as they reveled in what they thought was absolute dominance, their laughter echoing through the lodge. Every congratulatory glance, every approving nod toward Hazel, reinforced the illusion that I was powerless. Even the smart home system, my secret window into their world, felt like it had betrayed me. Minor glitches, unusual access logs, and slight errors suggested that they were actively guarding against interference. My confidence wavered for the first time. The pattern I had been tracking seemed muddled, the leverage I had counted on fraying at the edges. It was a bitter, private disappointment. I could feel the familiar sting of invisibility, the echo of years spent being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. Their enjoyment of the evening, their belief in my incapacity, made the house feel smaller, the walls tighter. Even the documents I had meticulously reviewed seemed insignificant against the public display of their control. Yet in that moment of apparent loss, a subtle realization began to form. Their overconfidence was also their weakness. In their effort to flaunt dominance, they left traces, small mistakes that only someone watching closely would notice. And beneath the sting of exclusion, a spark of calculation ignited, an understanding that the illusion of my defeat was just the stage being set for a far greater reversal. I retreated to my room that night, but not in surrender. Alone, I let the disappointment settle like dust, allowing my mind to sift through every detail of the evening. Their laughter, their careless confidence, the way they flaunted control, all of it was a performance, and I had a backstage pass. I reviewed the security feeds, cross-checked financial records, and traced patterns in their behavior that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. Isolation became a tool rather than a punishment. I no longer sought validation. I observed, calculated, and cataloged. Each small indignity, each overlooked instruction, each dismissive gesture was stored, not as pain, but as leverage for a moment that had not yet arrived. I reminded myself that endurance was not weakness, it was preparation. Patience was my strategy, invisibility my advantage. Even as Hazel and my parents reveled in what they believed was my passivity, I felt a quiet thrill. Every door left unlocked, every routine they took for granted, every assumption about my incapacity was now a potential key. My frustration had transformed into vigilance, my invisibility into insight. By the time the house fell silent, I had mapped every vulnerability, anticipated every possible reaction, and rehearsed the steps I would take when the opportunity finally arrived. I was no longer a passive observer. I was a strategist, waiting for the precise moment to act, knowing that restraint now would make the eventual reversal inevitable and complete. It wasn't a single revelation, but a slow convergence of details that opened my eyes. The inconsistencies in the house accounts, the repeated oversights in security protocols, the way my father relied on routines he assumed I wouldn't notice, they formed a clear, repeating pattern. Every dismissal, every laugh at my expense, every accidental oversight was part of a rhythm I could predict. I began to chart their behaviors, not as they presented themselves publicly, but as they truly were behind closed doors. Hazel's timing for checking the ledger, my father's tendency to leave cameras unattended, my mother's habit of pausing before replying to questions about finances, they were all pieces of a predictable sequence. Where they thought they were spontaneous and clever, I saw predictable regularity. Each observation sharpened my awareness, revealing a network of weaknesses hidden beneath their facade of control. The home, the trust accounts, the smart systems, each was a thread I could pull, a hinge I could tilt. The very tools they had used to assert dominance became instruments of my leverage, and for the first time, I felt the thrill of potential agency rising steadily in my chest. I realized that patience had not been wasted. It had trained me to see beyond appearances, to identify leverage where others saw routine. Their arrogance had created an invisible map of vulnerabilities, and the more they celebrated, the more traces they left behind. For the first time, I was not just enduring, I was anticipating, planning, and mentally rehearsing a reversal they would never suspect. And in that quiet, analytical clarity, a single thought crystallized. The evening of their ultimate miscalculation was already mapped in my mind. I knew exactly where I would strike first, and how completely it would shift the balance of power. While my family believed I was still passive, the truth was far more calculated. I had access they didn't suspect, complete visibility into every corner of the house via the smart system, detailed financial records they thought were private, and a network of small oversights I had quietly documented over months. Every unlocked door, every unattended camera, every ignored log entry became a tool I could use to tip the scales. They assumed my restraint was submission. In reality, it was strategy. I had identified which moments they were predictable, where their confidence made them reckless, and which systems could be manipulated without alerting them. The smart panels, Wi-Fi controls, lighting schedules, and climate settings, all of it was mine to command. I had even tested minor changes before, small enough to go unnoticed, but enough to reveal my growing competence to the audience, only not to them. Financially, I had uncovered discrepancies in the trust account. Transfers that had silently enriched Hazel over the years, statements that had been manipulated to appear balanced, and documents that could legally prove misappropriation. Each piece of evidence was safely stored, time-stamped, and verified, ready to be revealed at the precise moment. They believed I was powerless in the eyes of the law, but I had quietly ensured that I had the ultimate proof. This dual advantage, technological control and forensic evidence, was invisible to them, yet total. The audience could see it, a network of vulnerabilities and leverage points that, once activated, would render every act of their arrogance self-destructive. Every laugh, every dismissal, every smug glance they had offered would become the basis of their undoing. In the quiet of my control room, watching them celebrate what they thought was dominance, I allowed a small, private smile. They had no idea the evening would end differently than they had planned. The scales had already begun to tip, and they were completely unaware that the game had already moved out of their hands. As the evening shadows lengthened, I felt a subtle shift within myself. The humiliation I had endured, the constant dismissal, the isolation, they no longer defined me. Endurance had become strength, observation had become insight, and restraint had transformed into authority. I realized that power wasn't loud or reactive. It was patient, precise, and invisible until the moment of revelation. I examined my emotions carefully. Anger had once been my immediate reaction, but it had taught me nothing. Fear had been present, but it no longer controlled my decisions. What remained was a quiet clarity. Every decision, every hesitation, every subtle maneuver was deliberate. I had trained myself to see the world not as it appeared, but as it truly was, with its flaws and openings laid bare. In that quiet self-mastery, I began rehearsing scenarios in my mind. How would my father react if the doors locked automatically? If the lighting shifted to disorient him subtly? What would Hazel do if access to her accounts were temporarily blocked? I could predict them, anticipate their panic, and remain composed while the chaos unfolded around them. This internal transformation was deeper than strategy. It was a fundamental recalibration of self-worth. I no longer measured myself against their approval or their hierarchy. I measured myself against my own intelligence, patience, and foresight. Every slight they had inflicted now became a lesson in human behavior, a key to understanding their vulnerabilities. By the time the night drew on, I was no longer Nicole, the overlooked daughter. I was Nicole, the architect of inevitable reversal, quietly commanding outcomes from a position they would never see coming. And in that stillness, I felt an almost electric anticipation, the first true taste of control, of knowing that the next moves would belong entirely to me. With awareness and internal transformation complete, it was time to prepare. I moved methodically, cataloging every element I could manipulate in the house. Doors, lighting, climate, Wi-Fi, cameras, each system was mapped, tested, and synchronized. Minor changes over the past weeks had allowed me to measure responses and refine timing without raising suspicion. Tonight, everything would be seamless. I also reviewed the financial records in detail. Years of subtle misappropriation, transfers from my trust to Hazel's accounts, manipulated statements, they were all there, documented, verified, and time-stamped. I knew precisely how to present them, so that legal authority could act instantly. My parents believed that evidence would be difficult to trace, or that I lacked knowledge. They were wrong. Every discrepancy would point directly to deliberate wrongdoing, leaving no room for plausible deniability. Simultaneously, I rehearsed my personal approach. Calm, composed, and authoritative, I would remain silent until the moment demanded action. Every word, every gesture had to reinforce control while hiding the full extent of my leverage. Panic in their reactions would be part of the plan. Their own misjudgments were now tools to guide the outcome. I even anticipated attempts to override the systems. Passwords, backup codes, and fail-safes were adjusted to ensure no surprise could disrupt my design. The house, which they had always treated as a stage for their superiority, had now become mine to command entirely. By the early hours, every detail was in place. I could visualize the sequence of events, the initial confusion, the futile attempts at control, the legal intervention, and the irreversible shift in authority. Nothing was left to chance. This preparation wasn't just about revenge. It was about demonstrating the consequences of arrogance, the price of underestimating someone who had learned to observe, wait, and act with precision. The calm before the storm stretched silently around me, but beneath it, anticipation thrummed. The balance of power was about to tilt, and every carefully laid plan was set to unfold. The next evening, I entered the lodge with a composed smile, carrying the calm of someone who had nothing to prove, yet everything to reveal. My parents and Hazel were mid-celebration, still basking in the illusion of dominance. Their laughter, casual chatter, and careless movements were like a symphony of vulnerabilities I had memorized. I greeted them lightly, every gesture measured, every word neutral. Inside, I could see them testing me, small attempts to gauge whether I had noticed anything, but I gave nothing away. My presence alone unsettled them subtly. The calm I projected was a new variable in their predictable routine. As I casually passed the Smart System panel, my fingers hovered briefly over the interface. No dramatic gestures, no overt hints. The house responded silently to my control. Lights dimmed imperceptibly, climate subtly shifted, and doors that were once free to move now obeyed my commands. The shift was invisible to the naked eye, but the tension in the room began to thicken. Hazel glanced around, frowning, a hint of unease creeping into her confident posture. My father's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny reaction unnoticed by him but carefully catalogued by me. I observed every micro-expression, every hesitant movement, every delayed response. The power dynamic had subtly reversed. The arena remained the same, but I was no longer the overlooked participant. I was the one orchestrating the stage. And as I sipped my drink, maintaining perfect composure, I knew the first cracks had already appeared. Their arrogance, their assumption of control, and their dismissive patterns had become my tools. The moment of revelation was approaching, and every step I had prepared was ready to unfold with precision. Hazel, emboldened by her parents' approval, decided to push further. She reached for the home system panel, confident she could override whatever minor disruptions I had imposed. "Nicole, don't touch that! It's complicated," she said with a patronizing smile, assuming I lacked knowledge. My father chuckled, nodding in agreement, and my mother added a subtle warning glance. But every attempt they made to regain control only highlighted their underestimation of me. The doors they tried to unlock refused to budge. The lights, which they assumed were manual, shifted in response to commands only I could execute. Each failed effort increased the tension, though they remained unaware of the orchestration behind it. Panic flickered briefly in Hazel's eyes. My father's jaw tightened, and my mother's hands trembled as she tried to override the climate settings. Their overconfidence became their undoing. Each move they made, every attempt to assert authority, was anticipated and countered silently. The very arrogance they displayed, believing themselves untouchable, now left them exposed. I watched as subtle frustration mounted, their carefully rehearsed dominance cracking under the weight of their own miscalculations. And then, my father's frustration escalated further. In a moment of impulsive aggression, he smashed a glass against the wall, hoping to regain control through intimidation. It was the last error needed to trigger the chain I had prepared. Evidence, documented proof, and legal recourse all aligned. What they had believed was my fragility and compliance was in fact a trap meticulously designed to expose every misstep. As they fumed, I remained calm, silent, and observant. The balance of power had shifted entirely, yet the final act had not yet arrived. Every gesture they made, every frustrated movement, was feeding the narrative that would leave them accountable. Their overreach had become the instrument of their own downfall. The moment arrived with the quiet inevitability I had orchestrated. As my father stood fuming beside Hazel, the police arrived at the front door, summoned by a silent alert I had triggered, accompanied by the time-stamped evidence of their financial manipulations and illegal interference with the home systems. The officers entered, calm but authoritative, and my family froze, their faces betraying shock and disbelief. I stepped forward, composed, and presented the meticulously documented evidence. Bank statements showing repeated diversions of my trust, logs from the smart home system capturing their attempts to override security, and records of their habitual dismissals masked as ordinary oversight. Every document, every timestamp, every discrepancy left them no room to argue. Their smug confidence had vanished, replaced by panic, as the law made the facts undeniable. Hazel tried to protest, her voice shaking, but the officers asked pointed questions she couldn't answer. My father attempted to justify his actions, yet each claim was contradicted by the forensic proof I had prepared. My mother's attempts to intervene were futile, Her subtle nods and manipulations were no longer enough to shield them. In the span of minutes, their carefully constructed dominance crumbled entirely in the public eye. The house, once a stage for their arrogance, now bore witness to their complete exposure. I watched calmly as officers led my father and sister away, their faces a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. Every smirk they had worn over the years, every casual dismissal, every underestimation of me had led to this outcome. And then, the final revelation, a hidden clause in the trust and a secret account I had quietly secured years earlier. It ensured that my ownership and control of the property were legally irreversible. The last shred of their presumed authority evaporated. Standing in the center of the room, I finally allowed myself the smallest, private smile. The reversal was complete. The power, patience, and strategy one had cultivated over months had delivered undeniable justice. They had believed themselves untouchable, but their own overconfidence had become the instrument of their downfall. And in that moment, the room's silence was not my submission, it was my triumph, absolute and irrevocable. The aftermath unfolded like a storm breaking in slow motion. News of my father and Hazel's arrest spread quickly through family circles and neighbors alike, and whispers of the forensic evidence circulated before anyone could spin a narrative. My parents, once symbols of control and authority in our community, were suddenly subjects of scrutiny and ridicule. Their credibility, painstakingly built over decades, crumbled in hours. Even my mother, who had stayed in the background, felt the sharp sting of exposure. Friends and acquaintances who had quietly supported her misjudgments now distanced themselves. Invitations were rescinded, social standing evaporated, and the whispers of impropriety followed her everywhere. The humiliation was public, immediate, and irreversible, a direct consequence of the arrogance and deceit they had woven into their lives. I, on the other hand, remained poised and composed. From the outside, I appeared calm, collected, and entirely in control, but inside, there was a quiet satisfaction that radiated like warmth. Years of observation, endurance, and preparation had culminated in a moment where justice was not just served, it was undeniable. Their downfall was no longer hypothetical, it had been enacted with precision, leaving no room for revision or denial. By the time the evening ended, the community had witnessed the reversal of fortunes firsthand. The house, once a stage for their dominance, now stood as a symbol of my quiet authority, an arena where patience, intelligence, and strategic foresight had triumphed over arrogance and underestimation. The public collapse was complete, and with it, the message was clear: underestimating me had been their gravest mistake. As the dust settled, I revealed the final, hidden piece, a secure account and legal documents proving full ownership of the property, never contested, never known to anyone but me. The room went silent. Even my mother's attempts to intercede were futile. The law and evidence were indisputable. Every assumption of their superiority had been dismantled in one calculated sweep. The twist was unmistakable. While they had believed themselves untouchable, every smug glance, every casual dismissal, every minor oversight had become the foundation of their undoing. Their arrogance had written the blueprint for their own downfall. I, once overlooked and underestimated, now stood as the undeniable authority. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted irrevocably. The humiliation they had inflicted on me over the years returned tenfold, legally, publicly, and socially. And yet, it was not loud or chaotic. It was precise, controlled, and complete. I had turned patience, observation, and strategic foresight into instruments of justice. Standing in the center of the room, I felt an undeniable clarity. The game was over and I had won. They had underestimated me, but I had mastered the art of restraint, preparation, and decisive action. The night ended not with calm reflection, but with a resounding statement. Underestimation has consequences, and justice, when executed with precision, is both shocking and absolute.